that which lies beyond civilization.
The weird and the eerie.
She invents a rather primitive time travel machine. Not you can move up and down. Just you pick up a moment in time and you can do some little change there. So what she does in this scientist, there was in the village where Hitler was born, a small stream above, from which all the village was drinking.
I mean, maybe just so that sometimes I have seen my stuff described as alternate history or alternate universe, and I always want to say, no, it's this universe. It's this Los Angeles, not an alternate one, because I do I'm always aware of the necessity of making the reader think it's really happening to real people in real places. I know as a reader, I hate it if the writer deliberately or accidentally does anything to remind me that, in fact, this isn't real. In fact, this is fake. So I always want to scramble to try to convince the reader, no, this is here. This is the, you could drive to this place. It's real.
All right, we're back.
Whoa.
That was some Iron Maiden and a bunch of other things. And we're Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast. And I'm Steve.
I'm Marlowe.
And today we're talking about the chapter all about time travel called Caught in the Coils of Ouroboros, Tim Powers. And we're discussing Tim Powers' 1983 book, Anibus Gate, which I read and Marlowe read some of. As I mentioned, it came out in 1983, and it is a sci-fi fantasy novel that deals with a bunch of different themes, a bunch of different time travel paradoxes. But before he gets into any of that, he's got two quotes that we must go over before we start anything else.
Hell yeah.
These are some long ones, so bear with us until we get to our analysis of the book. The first one is from Writings 1997 to 2003, CCRU. CCRU is something we've discussed before. It is the writers collective.
Yes, group of philosophy students at Warwick in the 90s, organized under Sadie Plant and later Nick Land. They did a bunch of drugs and read philosophy and wrote stuff. And Nick Land then got fired for doing a bunch of drugs with his students.
Yep. But they wrote this Lovecraft-inspired series called Tales from the Cthulhu Club, which was at least 3 different short stories, and this is the third one.
I guess you could describe it as philosophically informed fiction.
Right. And this one follows Professor Randolph Edmund Templeton, who is teaching a criticism of H.G. Wells, which we discussed 2 chapters ago, and he's also delivering a lecture at Miskatonic University, which is a Lovecraft-invented university. So the quote is, Templeton sits immobile in his attic room, immersed in the deceptively erratic ticking of his old nautical clock lost in meditation upon J.C. Chapman's hermetic engraving. It now seems that this complex image, long accepted as a portrait of Kant, constitutes a disturbing monogram of his own chronological predicament. As if, in mockery of stable framing, the picture is surrounded by strange loop coilings of Ouroboros, the cosmic snake who traces a figure of 8 and of Mobian eternity by endlessly swallowing itself. Kind of use Kant here, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, and his book, The Critique of Pure Reason, as like an academic time traveling when discussing, I guess, objective truth, or, when you're time traveling, here is this categorical imperative, which is what Kant is known for, that is delivered objectively throughout time. And I think Professor Templeton is sort of reflecting on this, staring at this painting, portrait, and kind of having a moment with it in this little vignette.
It's probably mostly a coincidence, but one little fun thing is just the idea of the portrait as the time travel device, is that did literally come up earlier.
In our Patreon episode.
Yeah, in our Patreon episode.
Berkeley Square.
Yeah, Berkeley Square.
We discussed the movie Berkeley Square, which was a huge influence on Lovecraft and his story novella Shadow Out of Time. So check out our Patreon if you want to hear more about that.
Ultimately, in the play based on the book, but not the movie, it gets weird. But the way that the main character travels back in time is through a portrait of his ancestor that the ancestor crawls out of the portrait, he crawls in. So, yeah, similar, kind of portrait as a portal.
And as a time travel device, which is what we're discussing today.
Right, yeah. So we're mentioning the concept of the Ouroboros, which Fisher uses in the title of the chapter.
Basically the phrase, caught in the coils of Ouroboros.
Right.
What we're going to discuss with Anibus Gate is this idea that there is no beginning, there is no end. What is invented is sort of within this paradox of time travel. Like, when you go back in time, do you stay the same person that you were in present day? Do you become someone else? And when you do things that are in the past, are you still acting as yourself? Do you influence the future? And when you do stuff, can your future self already know about what has happened in the past?
Yeah, and I think this idea of, the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, this sort of notion of cyclical self-creation as it relates, I guess, as you described it with the CCRU, kind of talking about the categorical imperative as being this, logical self-birth of ethics, wherein the ethics arise from logic and the logic kind of arises from ethics. And it's similar to this notion of time travel and the time paradox that we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, the categorical imperative and sort of the arbitrariness by which one can call things objective.
Yeah, so then he moves on to not just the Zizek quote, but my favorite kind of Zizek quote, which is a quote from Sublime Object, because that's the one that I read.
The Sublime Object of Ideology from 1989.
The quote here is, "One is tempted to see in the time paradox of science fiction novels a kind of apparition in the real, of the elementary structure of the symbolic process, the so-called internal. Internally inverted, a circular movement, a kind of snare where we can only progress in such a manner that we overtake ourselves in the transference to find ourselves later at a point at which we've already been. The paradox consists in the fact that this superfluous detour, this supplementary snare of understanding ourselves, voyage into the future, and then reversing the time direction, voyage into the past, is not just a subjective illusion perception, conception of an objective process taking place in so-called reality independent of these illusions. The supplementary snare is rather an internal condition, an internal constituent of the so-called objective process itself. Only through the additional detour does the past itself, the objective state of things, become retroactively what it always was. I kind of love this quote. A central idea of Sublime Object is the notion that the illusion is not a stand-in for reality, but the illusion is part of reality. So Zizek wouldn't describe propaganda as saying they're misdirecting you from what's really true for some false truth. He would say, actually, you need to look at the propaganda to figure out what is really true, because often the truth that everyone believes behind the propaganda is the illusion as much as the propaganda. And he relates this to Freud, Lacan, interpretation of dreams, and so forth. This particular chapter, which is called
From Symptom to Symptom.
He takes this idea and eventually actually relates it to a concept in Rosa Luxemburg of the idea that a failed revolution of today provides the educational and material basis to make a successful revolution tomorrow. This is something Luxemburg discussed, and he kind of posits this idea of what if you told that to the working class on the eve of this failed revolution? What if you were to say to them, we're going to have a revolution tomorrow, it will fail. The point of this revolution is not to succeed, but it's to educate ourselves about how to do a successful revolution. The revolution itself would not serve that purpose. It would undermine the entire notion of it. The only way for it to serve that purpose is to commit to it as if it was going to succeed and then go forward from there. He's relating this to time travel in the same way as the idea of the categorical imperative is slightly more like Marxist Hegelian way of saying, like, if you're, say, your own grandfather, then only by birthing yourself are you alive to be your own grandfather, and only then can you be alive to be your own grandfather. It's this eternal cycle that is its own progenitor, again relating to the snake eating its own tail, Ouroboros, and so forth. So that's kind of what I got out of that quote.
To your point about Lacan, he in the next paragraph discusses truth. Transference is then an illusion, but the point is that we cannot bypass it and reach directly for the truth. The truth itself is constituted through the illusion proper to the transference. Quote, the truth arises from misrecognition. And that's a quote from Lacan.
Yeah, it's a central theme in Sublime Object that he's sort of relating it to time travel here is appropriate to this chapter and what we're going to be talking about.
I also want to bring up that this chapter is part of a longer essay that Fisher wrote for not quite K-Punk, but Hyperstition, which you can find online.
Link in the description.
It's called I Met a Man Who Wasn't There, The Ethics of Ashbless. In this, he discusses exactly that as well. He discusses what Zizek, Lacan, Deleuze, and Guattari, and in this essay he links it to Deleuze and Guattari, and Zizek both acknowledge Kafka is the prophet of the already dead, blah, 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 blah. Eschatology and the Last Judgment are misdirections, teleological confidence tricks concealing the fatal strategies through which control imminently operates. In here, he also links it to postmodernity and postmodern, which is why I think the way to frame this essay is Lovecraft and H.G. Wells are dealing with the questions of modernity and what does it mean to deal with these outside forces that are coming in as a result of a world that is filled with technological excellence, but also like people are still miserable.
It's opening things up both in terms of, technology brings with it the, nuclear bomb and this possibility of this apocalyptic future on the one hand. It opens up formerly small towns to an influx of immigrants. On the other hand, you're suddenly with this new world, new technology. Things are getting open to outside forces that previously people didn't have to deal with.
Right, and I feel like The Fall is also dealing with that through music form and trying to repackage it in a kind of countercultural way through the band. And in this, he specifically talks about postmodern. And in this, he says, to return to the Anibus Gate, so far as postmodern power goes, is dead, but it lives on, which is a quote by Land. There is no orthodoxy. There is only paradoxy. So I think that's where we can kind of move on. A quote in Tim Powers, and then we're going to start with Anibus Gate.
Steampunk, and so are you. One of the big three in the oeuvre of steampunk. How do you react to being called one of the fathers of steampunk?
I'm very pleased. At the time, of course, Blaylock and Jeter and I were simply researching and writing whatever sort of stories struck us as interesting at the moment, and through a complicated sort of series of accidents, we wound up focusing on Victorian London, and our sort of genetic predisposition was toward fantasy and science fiction. Mm-hmm. And so we, in 80 through 85 maybe, were happening to write a bunch of stuff that years later, retrospectively, got defined as steampunk. And I think, cool. I thought we were just messing around. How gratifying to find out that we were doing something worthy of the name.
Yeah. Well, as it stems out of the cyberpunk movement.
The name does. I don't know that the stuff we were writing was at all taking that derivation.
Carlos, international, transsexual composer of that glorious.
All right.
Okay, now we are on to this goddamn book.
This goddamn book called Anibus Gate.
By Timothy Powers.
Timothy Powers. Who is Timothy Powers?
American science fiction writer, apparently invented steampunk, I guess.
He was one of the big three.
Yes, one of the three guys, one of whom he was like college roommates with.
James Blaylock and K.W. Jeter.
I'm not a big steampunk person. I do know that Melville has like a whole fucking steampunk series, but...
One of the most difficult things about reading this, and I'm realizing this just now, is that I hate steampunk.
Yeah, I think you hate... Like, I'll straight up say, yeah, I read 50 out of 360 pages of this shit. I thought it was fine for the 50 goddamn pages. As far as my priorities of things I feel like reading right now, I wouldn't care to read another 310 pages of it, but, like, it didn't seem unreadable.
It's not unreadable. Okay, so what is it? It's this guy...
I mean, at its basic story, it's a dude gets, like, recruited by a rich person to be a tour guide for a time travel mission he's, like, putting together, selling tickets for $1 million a piece to other rich people to go back in time and be like, look, we can go back in time. There's also a fucking Weyland-Yutani Prometheus subplot where the rich guy's dying of cancer and he's sort of like researching unorthodox ways of curing his cancer. But unlike, you know, Steve Jobs, who's like, oh, what if I ate blueberries? He's like, what if I like discovered witchcraft is real and invented time travel? Yeah, I mean, that's the basic story is The main character is this professor of literature. They are going back in time to like 1890 to hear some fucking poet read his poems at like a bar or something.
Yep, Samuel Coleridge. He's a biographer of both Samuel Coleridge and William Ashbless.
Is Coleridge a real person or
Yes.
not? Okay.
A very famous British romantic poet. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is known mostly for The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Oh, fuck, okay.
And Kubla Khan. Kubla Khan is a famous poem, but most people who have a high school level
Hell yeah.
of poetry only know Rime of the Ancient
Hell
Mariner.
yeah.
He was sort of an early transcendentalist, and
Yeah, that's in England.
he was an influence on Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he was more in line with later romantic poets. Yeah, he was friends with all these, British romantics.
Well, scratch what I said earlier. I guess it's not the 1890s. It's like the 10s. Sure.
Specifically, he goes back in time on a day that the rich guy knows that he's giving a famous reading. And this is the tour guide. Brendan Doyle acts as the tour guide.
The way they travel back in time, and this becomes weirdly important, is magic.
Yeah.
So like the subplot of this is an ancient cult of Egyptian god worshippers in the early 19th century try and do a spell to make Anubis appear, and instead they just make time portals exist.
Yeah.
And then this rich guy in the 1980s is like, how can I cure my cancer? And he like studies Aleister Crowley and is like, oh, I guess time travel's real. Let's go back in time.
Yeah. And it's described as like a river, and that there's different jumping off points, and that you have to know where the jumping off points are in order to go through, and that you can only come back in certain times that it jumps back in.
Yeah.
And the annoying thing about this is that they back to the 1890s, and they jump back to like
1810s and then the 1600s.
Yeah. And it's very convoluted. There's a lot of running around, there's a lot of chasing. At some points there's like fire monsters that start chasing the main guy. There's werewolves. The werewolf is like a major character. There's tiny little people on ships that act as like spies, but also like soldiers for the main bad guy, who is a little person clown, which we only find out that he's a little person because his father cast a spell on him. He has to be elevated because he can only do magic if his feet aren't on the ground, so he's on stilts the whole time. And anyone that's doing spells and magic are all on stilts, but because of the magic, they're shrinking as they age.
Oh, that sounds great, Steven.
I read it and I was like, what is going on here?
Yeah, it's okay. It sounds like if Discworld took itself way too seriously. But anyway, so the central thing that happens that really is the only point to why this story's in the fucking chapter and is the basis of the entire chapter is there's a time paradox in it. There's a time loop in it, specifically concerning a made-up poet named William Ashbless, who is in the novel world like kind of a second-rate poet of the era.
Yeah, he's a lesser minor poet.
Right, that this professor happens to 100% like be the greatest authority on because it's a very small field. Yeah, so through shenanigans, this dude gets stuck back in time. Is like, I guess if I'm stuck back here, I can meet this fucking Ashbless guy, because, like, he's sort of a mysterious guy, not a lot's known about him. So he shows up at a bar that Ashbless wrote this poem. He's like, oh, Ashbless didn't show up. Let me boldly write the poem that Ashbless wrote at this bar.
He's getting frustrated.
And then, essentially, lo and behold, he's fucking Ashbless, like, obviously. But the interesting element is you ask the question, where did this poem come from? Because he didn't make up the poem. He wrote the poem from memory because he was the premier authority on Ashbliss, and he read that poem a million times. But Ashbliss never existed to write the poem. So really, he wrote the poem from a memory that he only had because he wrote the poem. And that is...
He read about the poem.
Well, also, yeah, read about and the poem itself.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the central idea. Also, weirdly, the eccentric rich person who's basically the Wayland Yutani is named Clarence Darrow, which is like the most famous attorney in American history before Johnny Cochran, and I have no idea why he's named Clarence Darrow. He just fucking is. So those are my thoughts on the book.
Okay, so there's some backstory to William Ashbliss. He was invented by Tim Powers and his best friend James Blaylock, who was also a sci-fi writer who we talked about in the clip earlier. And the two of them, because they're pranksters and they hated the bad poetry at the California State University, Fullerton, where they went to, invented this poetry named William Ashbliss and started writing bad poetry and then started submitting it. And then when it was accepted and they were asked to come read the poetry, they would make up excuses for why William Ashbliss couldn't be there and then read the poems on his behalf. And it just became an inside joke that they both had. And then both of them wrote novels using that name, and Anibus Gate uses the name, and then Blaylock's 1984, The Digging Leviathan, uses a lesser known character
A more minor
with the
character.
same name.
Yeah. It was basically, their college paper had this poetry column. It was this very, like, it was 1970s, so, like, this very, like, hippy-dippy freeform poetry that they then parodied under the name William Ashbliss, and allegedly then this poet, not only was his poems accepted in the column, but, like, also, like, people in the poetry circles, like, all started to really like his poetry.
And the thing that reminds me a little bit of Lovecraft is that you never get the full poem, and Tim Powers is putting him next to both Coleridge and then later Lord Byron.
Yeah.
Lord Byron shows up because he's from around the same time, and also the cult people make a double of Lord Byron who is masquerading as the real Lord Byron.
Yeah, fascinating.
Here's a bit of the 12 Hours of the Night, which is the fake poem that was written by William Ashbliss, and it sort of sets up the novel as like the beginning page. They moved in dark, old places of the world, like mariners, once healthy and clear-eyed, who, when their ship was holed, could not admit ruin and the necessity of flight, but chose instead to ride their cherished wreck down into darkness, there, not quite to drown, but ever on continue plying sails against the midnight currents of the depths, moving from pit to lightless crag in hopeless search for some ascent to shore, and who, in their decayed, slowing voyaging, do presently lose all desire for light and air and living company. From here, their search is only for the deepest groves, those farthest from the nigh forgotten sun. So that's a little bit of that. And as the novel unfolds, as Brendan Doyle, before he realizes he's William Ashbliss, starts having conscious thoughts of like, this is where William Ashbliss must have gotten the line from the poem.
Right.
It's again very Lovecraftian in that there's no suspense. You realize it way before the character realizes that he's William Ashbliss, like from the second he scribbles it down. And it has that Lovecraft element of like there's no real mystery to what the twist is.
Mark Fisher. He pulls this notion of The Shining into it, the whole Jack Torrance, you've always been the caretaker line, again to drive home this notion of this cyclical time that is both outside of, but a part of our linear conception of time. So not only is this poem only existent because it was written by this guy who only wrote it because the poem existed, but also, I mean, the poem exists throughout all of time and other people can read it too. So it is, again, to get to this notion of the weird, it's this outside thing that ought not exist inside but is inside. Yeah, I mean, his general notion in this chapter is the time paradox is weird because it is the outside brought in. Because it is this uncreated thing, it seems to be a central theme to all this.
The quote that he gives from the book kind of speaks to this, and this is where I really link it to the difference between modernity and postmodernism, this idea of questioning the origin of it. There doesn't seem to be a fixed origin. As you said, it's cyclical. The poem only exists in this cyclical time loop. It hadn't come too much of a surprise to him when he'd realized, after writing down the first few lines of the 12 hours of the night, that while his casual scrawl had remained recognizably his own, his new left-handedness made his formal handwriting different, though by no means unfamiliar, for it was identical to William Ashblyth's. And now that he'd written the poem out completely, he was certain that if a photographic slide of the copy that in 1983 would reside in the British Museum, they would line up perfectly, with every comma and I dot of his version perfectly covering those of the original manuscript. Original manuscript, he thought with a mixture of awe and unease. This stack of papers here is the original manuscript. It's just newer now than it was when I saw it in 1976. Ha ha! I wouldn't have been so impressed to see it then if I'd known that I had made it or would have make those pen scratches. I wonder then where and how I'll pick up the grease marks. I remember seeing them on the early pages. Suddenly, a thought struck him. My God, he thought, then if I stay and live out my life as Ashblyth, which the universe pretty clearly means me to do, then nobody wrote Ashblyth's poems. I'll copy out his poems from memory, having read them in the 1932 collected poems, and my copies will be set in type for the magazines, and they'll use tear sheets from the magazines to create the collected poems. They're a closed loop, uncreated. I'm just the messenger and caretaker.
Yeah.
Fisher earlier in the chapter compares this to a number of other sci-fi and fantasy writers that do a similar theme or a similar paradox. He mentions All You Zombies and By His Bootstraps by Robert Heinlein.
Favorite fascist of the show.
Friendly fascist of the show. But as you mentioned, All Your Zombies has I'm my own grandpa paradox.
Yeah, it has the dream of those with gender dysmorphia everywhere come to truth, wherein a simple sex change operation can allow you to impregnate not just someone, but yourself from a different timeline. Yeah, it's this rather famous Heinlein thing that apparently comes from the story All You Zombies. I haven't read it. I've read about the paradox. But effectively, it's like this baby is left at an orphanage, doesn't know their parents. The baby is, I think, AFAB.
All Your Zombies chronicles a young man later revealed to be intersex, taken back in time and tricked into impregnating his younger female self.
Right. I'm just...
Before he was forced to undergo sexual reassignment surgery.
So I'm just starting the story from the perspective of the younger self as the baby. But again, this is the thing with loops, is if you start on one side of the circle, you'll eventually get to the other side of the circle. So Point is, this dude's his own dad, but like also there's a song called "On My Own Grandpa" that's incorporated into the story.
In the ending, he allows a customer to play "I'm My Own Grandpa" on the jukebox, having yelled at the customer for playing the song before he left. Closing the bar, he time travels again to his home base in 1993. Yeah, no, there's this amazing song that I grew up with because my grandmother loved the songs of the 40s, and it was a hoot.
He's his own grandpa. Now, many years ago when I was 23, I was married to a widow who was pretty as could be. This widow had a grown-up daughter, had the hair of red. My father fell in love with her and soon the two were wed. This made my dad my son-in-law and changed my very life. My daughter was...
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's not how being intersex works, but frankly, I didn't do the sort of research that Robert Heinlein did, so who am I to fucking judge?
This brings up something that Fisher discusses in the longer version of this essay, which is something you and I think, independently discussed, which is that Oedipus Rex is one of the first time traveling stories, if not the first time traveling story, because he becomes his own father.
Yeah.
And that Oedipal, I guess, out of jointness oftentimes gets overlooked when discussing the myth.
Yeah.
So he also compares it to another sci-fi writer, Michael Moorcock, who has a great name.
Yeah.
Michael Moorcock I know because he worked with both Blue Oyster Cult and Hawkwind, one of my favorite bands. Hawkwind especially is known for using sci-fi tropes and being a sci-fi band. Early band for the Motorhead's Lemmy. And Michael Moorcock added lyrics, did a lot of collaboration, and he apparently wrote Behold the Man, which I did some research on this, and it seems pretty cool.
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't meander on about fucking werewolves for like 187 pages.
It's actually sequel to Breakfast in Ruins, which sounds like a great title, which follows Carl Glogauer, who time travels back 2,000 years from the 1960s and through a bunch of hijinks finds Jesus. Jesus is like a mute. He can only say the word Jesus over. He says Jesus, Jesus, Jesus over and over again. And then he has a hunchback and is really ugly. And this character is like, no, you have to be a great man. Since you're not the great man, I'm going to be the great man. And then he just starts scheming by like telling people how they can pretend to have more bread than they do, and he does all the explains the miracles as...
Sounds like such a more fun story. Sounds so clean. It sounds like it's very like this guy had one idea, and he just stuck to one idea.
Yeah, and then obviously the fanaticism of this guy is that he sees through Jesus' life and
nonetheless needs Jesus to be real, so it literally takes up the cross upon himself. Yeah, ends up like fucking being the actual origin of the Jesus myth, which again he was only, doing from his memory of being a devout Christian.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds like a very tight fucking narrative.
Yeah, it sounds like it's got a solid beginning, middle, and end.
You have one idea, and you make your story about that idea. And then if you have another idea, you write another story. Or work with fucking Hawkwind and, like, just write the lyrics for a little ditty.
Yeah, let's play one of their little ditties.
Got flutes happening.
Yeah, fucking flutes.
Anyway.
Oh yeah, some time-traveling flute players right there. One of the things that reminds me so much of a Lovecraftian narrator is that this guy he's a pretty dumb, naive, like, academic. And that's, I think, something that I realized very quickly when reading it, that, oh, I can see how this fits within a lineage of what Fisher's interested in, or CCRU's interested in, because they're apparently all about Lovecraft, Wells, and everything else. And this has this kind of naive cosmopolitan who just bumbles his way into these very strange and weird environments. I'm using weird here as it's literally Escher-esque. He describes it at some point like the London of the 1810s is very Dickensian. He was influenced by London labor and the London poor, which was Mayhew, and it was like a Victorian novel. He was mentioning like that he was really into reading Victorian novels early on. And Fisher compares it to part Oliver Twist, part The Western Lands by Burroughs, which also has like Egyptian gods and the Book of the Dead as its background foundational mythology that exists underneath it. But he just like scrambles all of these ingredients together into one book.
Yeah. I think the like naive academic is like kind of almost a stock sci-fi character. Like, this is a very stock sci-fi book, which is mysterious, eccentric, rich guy gathers one or more PhDs from eclectic fields to do this ill-defined project of theirs that they only find out about when they go to... I mean, it's basically Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, oh, you're a paleontologist? Yeah, this rich guy wants you to, like, come to fucking some island off the coast of Puerto Rico. Also, he has, like, Jeff Goldblum, who's a, like, mathematician, and he has, like... Yeah, he wants your sort of on-again, off-again paleobotanist to come along. What could be going on? I don't know. I need a mathematician, a paleontologist, and a paleobotanist to come to some island. Yeah, you know, oh, I'm interviewing PhDs of early 19th century British Romanticism for this, like, secret project that you need to fly out overnight to England and come to my mysterious mansion to find out about.
Yeah, the other stock thing that a little askew, a little out of joint, but nevertheless, is that he knows that William Ashbless gets married to this rich aristocratic woman, and when he goes back in time, because he has no money, he becomes a beggar. It kind of has that realism to it, like he's not wealthy himself, he has no money, he's thrown back in time without anything. So he has to start begging, and that's how he gets in with this Harabin the clown, who runs the underground beggar underground beggar universe. And through that, he meets this young boy, Jackie, who is a fellow beggar and like has a mustache and whatnot. And throughout the whole thing, he's like, oh my God, William Ashbless is gonna marry this beautiful woman and go on, and she's gonna basically give him all his riches because I know that he was penniless before they married. And it ends up being Jackie, the beggar boy, was cross-dressing the whole time.
Okay.
And it's like,
Sure.
Come on, man, that's so stupid.
Yeah.
So stupid. And like, she saves him multiple times, and the whole time he's like, something about you, I really like hanging out with you, but I can't put my finger on it.
There's another fucking Futurama clip for that one.
Oh, we didn't go over the Dog-Faced Joe myth that...
Yeah, we were discussing werewolves obliquely, but...
Dog-Faced Joe is sort of what the rich guy, Clarence Darrow, reads about. And essentially it's this guy who goes around and switches bodies with somebody, and then the old body dies and the new one gains like werewolf, and he's known as Dog-Faced Joe, and so there's this werewolf running around London killing people and switching with their bodies until the body runs out and he has to find a new body. And essentially what the rich guy wants as his save me from cancer is to find Dog-Faced Joe and switch bodies with him.
Sure.
To save him from cancer or discard the cancerous body that he has so he can live eternally.
Mm-hmm.
And keep switching bodies as long as he wants. Yeah. And yeah, Dog-Faced Joe does this switched body, and that's how Brendan Doyle gets into the new body of William Ashbless, which is why he's unrecognizable.
Yeah, and is left-handed and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, he's also described as almost 7 feet tall and has superhuman strength and can't be killed, and he becomes a fighter when he goes back in time and battles the fire spellcasters, and there's a lot of spell casting. And for me, I don't know if it's just I don't like fantasy and or I don't like this type of fantasy, steampunk fantasy, but it got very tedious very quickly, and I would not recommend it. In a similar way to how Marlowe feels about The Fall, I feel about Anibus Gate.
Yeah, it sounds like it could have been 200 pages and just about the poem thing. Yeah, it is the chapter that is us talking about time travel. Oh no, there's also the movie Looper. That's fun.
Okay, so we'll finish off with this paragraph. I'll just read the last. Once Doyle realizes, finally, I'm including that, finally, after 300 pages, he finally realizes that he is destined to be Ashbless, which is to say that he already was Ashbless. He is faced with a dilemma. Does he act in accordance with what he characterizes as the will of the universe, or not? The problem that Doyle faces is that the determinism is much more invariant than the will, even a will that belongs to the universe. It is impossible for him to process that everything he will do as Ashbless has already happened. The barrier that means that this cannot be faced is transcendental. Subjectivity as such presupposes the illusion that things could be different. To be a subject is to be unable to think of oneself as anything but free, even if you know that you are not. What sustains Doyle's presupposition is the apparently spontaneously emerging hypothesis of an alternative past. In order to hold open the possibility that things might go against the already recorded Ashbless biography, Doyle is forced to consider the possibility that he has somehow crossed into a different past to the one he has seen documented. But the full paradox is that it is only Doyle's positing of such an alternative past that ensures that he acts in accordance with what has already happened. Ashbless becomes the hero he already was, the restorer of an order that was never threatened. Everything is as it always was, only now, as Doyle and the reader know, something weird has happened. And with that, we leave you on Uriah Heep, Traveler in Time. See you next week where we discuss Fassbinder and
Philly Dix.
Philip K. Dick.